Okay, good morning. I got the thumbs up from Brian, so I guess we're ready to go here. Continuing on in our series on African American religious biography. For the beginning this morning, I'm going off script a little bit, cheating a little bit, but I have good reasons. Well, I don't know if I have good reasons. I'm giving you a good excuse. Biographies are autobiographies are individuals, and in this series we're going to do a lot on blacks who, many of whom were enslaved and then liberated. Olawale Equiano and Richard Allen, as I mentioned last week, and Frederick Douglass today, and then later Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman next week. And these are great, and they're right, these stories of blacks who had been in slavery and got their freedom, and what role faith played in all of that. But it's actually, thinking as a historian, it's actually really hard to capture what it was like for enslaved people who did not get their freedom. And a lot of that is because, of course, they didn't leave records behind, very few records behind. Enslaved people, literacy rates were very, very low. Illiteracy was well over 90%. Just didn't have opportunity to leave records. But historians have done a number of good things to try to, piece things together. So we're taking kind of a group look at enslaved Christians, because we don't have a lot of work on individuals. But we have this, I think it's really good and important to try to uncover what we can about the lives of black Christians who were not freed. And so I'm going to do that briefly this morning. How did faith work for them, those who became Christians? And a lot of enslaved blacks were not Christians, but how did faith work for them in that situation? So to start off, I'm intrigued by a little situation. We have a record of a group of enslaved Christians who were gathered in a clearing by a woods in Liberty County, Georgia, on a Sunday afternoon in March of 1833. And they were gathered there for a worship service, and a white preacher had just preached a sermon to them, and they were objecting. They said things like, the doctrine is one-sided, and this is not the gospel at all. It's run away, run away, run away. And some others told the white preacher they would never come back to hear him preach anymore. And others actually had left, got up and walked away. Walked out. They were outside. You don't walk out when you're already out. Walked away, left the meeting during the middle of the service. Now, I find this interesting for a number of reasons. The minister, the white minister at this time, was a man named Charles Colcock Jones, and he himself was a slave owner, a powerful slave owner. He owned quite a few slaves himself. And it was a dangerous thing for slaves to challenge slave owners, or show disrespect, or object to, or disagree with slave owners, or any white person in authority for that matter. In many cases, any one of those actions, objecting or disagreeing or showing disrespect, could lead to some sort of punishment. And so here they are, many of them, rather clearly and publicly displaying this objection to this slave owner. And the objection, right, is religious. That they're not objecting to Christianity itself. What's interesting is like you're preaching Christianity. It's not that he's preaching Christianity, it's that his version of Christianity. Most of those in the crowd that morning, I think it really was sort of an outdoor congregation, would have been Christians, although there would have been a number that were, I don't know, interested or seekers or whatever you want to call them. And they weren't objecting to Christianity. In fact, this was a Sunday afternoon, and in the morning, it was the second service of the day. In the morning, Jones had preached to them in the same place in the morning, and he preached on a different topic, on idolatry and different forms of idolatry, and they'd received him just fine. That was okay with him. What they were arguing over that afternoon was, well, the other thing is this that I want to mention. They were challenging a man who was not only a slave owner, but was a minister. And not only was a minister, he had a seminary degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. And so here are these blacks who, many of them just have barely a primary education. Most of them would not have been able to read. There were a few in that group that could read. And they were challenging him on a fundamental point of Christian doctrine. And they were right, and he was wrong. And I find that really very interesting. Now, Charles Colcock Jones, just a few months before this, had launched a project, a grand project. He wanted to have a mission to the slaves. He felt like enslaved people needed to become Christians, and he wanted to go out and evangelize them. By the way, Jones was a good Presbyterian, and he was actually a member of the denomination that we are also members of, although it split for a while, north and south, but then came back together. But yeah, it's still us. But he wanted enslaved people to become Christians, and he actually encountered opposition from some other slave owners. They didn't want him to preach to slaves because they thought that would be dangerous. I think they were probably right. All indications are over the long term. But he thought that Christianity would make slaves better slaves. Well, not necessarily. And on this Sunday afternoon, he was stunned by their reaction, by their objections, and by their pushback to him. His sermon that afternoon, and that was the key, his sermon was on Onesimus in the book of Philemon. Which is a runaway slave, or maybe sometimes translated bondservant in that book of the Bible. And Paul was instructing him to go back to his master. And Charles Colcock Jones was using that book to try to tell these enslaved people and instruct them how to be obedient slaves and what their duties to their masters were, which of course meant that running away was a really, really bad thing. But see, here's the thing. Every enslaved person knew already what their master expected of them. Like, they didn't need to be instructed on what was, what was expected in terms of obedience. That wasn't their issue. In their eyes, something in the Christian faith was at stake by declaring that this is not the gospel at all. And that's an interesting phrase. And by the way, we get this account from Charles Colcock Jones's own letters, things that he wrote down. He was explaining what happened that afternoon, and this is how Jones explained it. They said, "This is not the gospel at all." Whoever that black Christian was, see, it isn't just that we've got a little bit different interpretation of the faith, or differences of denomination. You're a Baptist and you believe in adult baptism, and I'm Presbyterian, I believe in infant baptism, or something like that. What they're objecting to here was like, we're getting down to the core of the gospel. We're getting down to something really, really important, and they were objecting to that. And for these enslaved Christians, what they saw was not just an obscure theological point, but right down to the center of the gospel, that God frees us from more than just our sins. And the ironically named Liberty County, Georgia, where they lived, was not granting, the people there were not granting full liberty to, of course, all the people. In the antebellum era, pro-slavery Christians like Charles Colcock Jones argued that one of the benefits of slavery was that it brought Christianity to Africans, to blacks. And Jones and others like him were wrong. That was bad analysis. Because I think if you really start looking at the big picture, what you'll find is that Christianity grew among enslaved people despite slavery, not because of slavery, and that slavery actually was a barrier and a hindrance and an obstacle to the Christian faith, a point I think that would have surprised Jones. But that afternoon, he was not only wrong in his interpretation of the Bible, he was inadvertently erecting a barrier to Christianity from, for any of those people in his congregation who might be thinking of adopting the faith, and he didn't realize he was undermining his own efforts at evangelism. And in fact, if we go back earlier, white efforts starting in the colonial era to evangelize enslaved people did not go well. The Anglican Church had a formal effort to try to evangelize blacks starting in the late 17th century in the colonial era, and it just had very, very little success. When we get to what is often called the First Great Awakening, the time of George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards in the 1740s and 50s, you start to see a few more people of African descent converting to Christianity. And then later things pick up. But, you've got more than a century where very, very few enslaved people or even free blacks were converting to Christianity. And in one way, if you look at it, from the perspective of religions that are competing with one another, this is not really surprising. Why would a black person listen to a white person saying, "Hey, we've got this religion. You should think about our God," when the whole reason the black person was there is that they're being enslaved? Why is that? Why should that be appealing to me? And your God is different, and it's tied to a different culture, and you have different sort of worship. And on top of that, I see all you Christians are basically what you're doing is abusing people. And so in some ways, it's really surprising from that perspective that blacks would adopt the Christian faith. But then they did. They started to, in notable numbers, in a time period that we sometimes call the Second Great Awakening, after the American Revolution, 1790s, 1800, 1810, 1820s, and especially among Baptists and Methodists, Christianity grew quite a bit. Now, why? There's several things going on. One thing is that these Baptist and Methodist revivalists allowed expressive and enthusiastic sort of ways of worshiping, which fit well with the African cultural tradition of spirituality, where you engaged the spirit world, you engaged the gods through dancing and singing and very expressive sort of modes, and Anglicans weren't really into that, but the Baptists and Methodists allowed that, so that fit. But that doesn't really explain everything. This revivalist Christianity was based on sort of a direct oral communication with God in a way that didn't fit well with say, the Anglicans. Many African Americans would have trances or visions or prophecies. In fact, we saw last week Olawade Equiano, right, a key moment in his life where he had a vision of Christ on the cross. That was very African, and Baptists and Methodists allowed that and accepted those claims as well. But I think there's more to it than that, and there's several other kind of cultural and social things about why things fit there. But I think that when you get down to what enslaved people were finding in the gospel, a great source is if you look at the spirituals. And we have a lot of spirituals that were written by unknown people. We don't know who they are. They were, enslaved people at some point, at some place, and these were written, I guess, composed, but sung and transferred orally, and then eventually written down, right? And so here we have, I've been buked, I've been scorned, you may talk about me sure as you please, you may talk me sure children, you may talk about me sure as you please. Jesus Christ died to set me free. Jesus Christ died to set me free. And now we're starting to get right into an understanding of how they saw, what they saw in the gospel. Christ's death does something, and it sets me free. And so this is a fairly orthodox, traditional sort of Christianity in terms of looking at Christ on the cross and so forth. And so you have a lot of spirituals that sing about Jesus and the cross in various sort of ways. But there are other themes you find in spirituals. So one of the I don't know how many of the there's just so many, and our choir, by the way, will sing, I think, fairly regularly spirituals, which is really very nice. But I don't know how many of these you know. God is a rock in a weary land, or Steal Away, or Deep River, or Were You There? Anyway, those are all examples of spirituals. But one of the most famous ones, right? Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. The key part is this verse here. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming forward to carry me home. A band of angels coming after me, coming forward to carry me home. Jordan, the Exodus, the Promised Land, Canaan land. What you find is this theme is another theme, another major theme that keeps coming up in the spirituals. Crossing over Jordan. Deep river, deep river. My home is over Jordan. The Promised Land. Now, what are we talking about when we're talking about my home is over Jordan? And I think that it works on a number of different levels here. I looked over Jordan. What did I see? Band of angels coming after me. I mean, at one level, you're talking about someday going on to heaven. So in this way, you can see that Christianity provides a certain amount of hope. Crossing Jordan is hope. This life is really, really very difficult and painful, but someday, there will be no more tears, no more pain, so forth. Jesus is coming for me again. But we look at a few more themes here of Jordan. One of the great ones is wade in the water. Wade in the water. God's going to trouble the water. The Jordan River is chilly and cold, chills the body, but not the soul. Okay. God's going to trouble the water. If you know the story in Joshua, when the children of Israel are about ready to cross over the Jordan, the priests take the Ark of the Covenant up to the Jordan River, which is in springtime, and it's at flood stage and roaring and just this massive river, and they step into the Jordan and it parts. It's a little Red Sea moment, right? God's going to trouble the water. That's crossing over into Jordan. Now, my sister-in-law, who is black, went to a black Baptist church once, and they always sang this at baptism when people would come up and get baptized. And now we start to see how this is working on several different levels, right? So, wade in the water, the Promised Land, coming out of slavery, from Exodus, from Egypt. Suddenly you realize, well, what does that mean? In baptism, it can mean a number of things. In baptism, it means you're going under the water. You are dying to your old sins. You are being liberated from sin. But in the black tradition, or if you think about it in the slave situation, means that, and it means other things too. It can mean like swing low, sweet chariot. Someday, the Promised Land. We're going to cross over from this world and all its troubles into this land into this place of freedom and liberation. But it can also mean the hope that someday in this life we will be freed from the injustices of slavery before we die. That someday slavery itself and the injustices of slavery itself will be gone. And so what we find in black Christian tradition in the days of slavery, not just talk about Jesus and the cross, and of course that is there quite a bit also, but all these references to Exodus and the Jordan River. Another one that's, and that's because, what slaves saw in the Bible, especially when they read the Old Testament, was really the fundamental narrative of the Old Testament, is the Exodus. Who is this God? And God will say several times, and we can go to the other verses in Psalms and so forth, I am the Lord your God. Listen to this, what the Lord your God of Israel says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Oh, no, this sounds like a God worth listening to at this point. So while a lot of white slave owners like Charles Colcock Jones and others are saying, okay, this is what God says about slaves, obey your masters. And like, wait. Those that had gotten access to the Bible are saying, what about this? What about this? Isn't this a God who frees people? Isn't this a God who liberates people? And so you see this theme of the Jordan coming through in spirituals quite a bit. In fact, in black culture, you can see it, I think, subtly in some other ways. When these people were enslaved, they usually just had one name. They didn't even have the dignity of having a last name. And then the Civil War comes, and abolition, emancipation comes, and suddenly they're free. And a lot of them get black people, freed people, now get to take up a last name. Well, what last name do you take? And you can take a lot of different name from that's around you somewhere, or one you're familiar with, or something like that. But you see a few names popping up in black culture that you don't. Some enslaved people just took the name, actually, the last name of their master, for instance. You might take Jones, because I don't know, this is the era that we're in. But you see a few names that pop up that are not common last names for whites, but fit this theme, right? So, and unless you're a LeBron James fan, who is the greatest basketball player of all time? Michael Jordan. Or who was the baseball player who broke Babe Ruth's record for career home runs? Henry Aaron, Moses' brother. Or some of you remember in the 1980s, a famous Olympic hurdler who won the gold medal, I think, of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, Edwin Moses. So Moses, the Jordan, these themes get embedded in black culture in various ways. And a more obvious sort of song along this way, you just want to go right to the point, to go down Moses. When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go, oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. And so you have in what happened with African American Christianity that grew and forged in sort of this fiery furnace of the great injustices of slavery is that on the one hand you have something that a lot of Americans recognized, which is the spiritual side of being liberated from sin and Jesus dying on the cross, but then also you have a deep sense of God is also a God who fights injustice. And that we need to be freed from more than just our sins. And that becomes a key part of black Christianity, which is still present today. And I would say this, that I think like those enslaved people in Liberty County, Georgia, they saw things more clearly in the gospel than what whites saw. Like they saw that the fundamental narrative of the Old Testament is the Exodus. That is a story that tells us about the character of God. The Old Testament is not just laws or just sort of a warm-up to the New Testament, but that's one of the key stories, and it tells us a key thing about God's character. And that's something they saw that a lot of white Christians did not see very, very clearly. And so those enslaved blacks who were telling Charles Colcock Jones, this is not the gospel. I mean, they're saying, oh, you're wrong on one of your points. No, like, this is not the gospel. You don't have the fullness of the gospel. Liberation is a key part of all of that. And so for them, running away was not breaking the law. That was not like doing something wrong in terms of running away from proper authority. It was escaping injustice. I mean, ironically enough, very few enslaved people in Liberty County, Georgia, could run away. It was very hard from that point to run away. But they had it in their mind. No, running away is not a sin. It's the opposite. It is the gospel in its fullness. It's a type of liberation from injustice and oppression. So they were pushing back on Charles Colcock Jones. They understood this. That brings us to somebody else who was very, very good at pushing back, Frederick Douglass, who I talked a bit about last year, that some of you may have been here when I talked a bit about Frederick Douglass on another topic. Frederick Douglass was a black abolitionist who grew up in slavery, escaped, ran away, published a memoir, a very famous memoir that is still read today, and one of the more famous slave narratives today. Between 1840 and 1890, he was, some people estimate, to be the most widely traveled and maybe most often heard public person in America, with the possible exception of Mark Twain. I mean, he just kept traveling and speaking and traveling and speaking. Not that everybody liked to hear him, but he was well known in many ways. The story I told last year, I'm going to briefly tell again, just because I think it's such a great speech. At a time when he was very young, 24, and he had just recently escaped from slavery and was starting into his abolitionist phase. He would often include a speech and realize this was a time when stereotypes against blacks included one that was, black men could be dangerous, almost animal-like people who don't have self-control. Frederick Douglass would get up before a white audience and say, "I appear before this assembly as a thief and a robber. I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master, and ran off with them." Which I think is just such a great opening, it's so effective rhetorically, right? It's so effective in getting you to stop to think, playing on that stereotype. Oh my gosh, here's a thief. Oh, because he ran away from slavery. Wait a minute, you can't steal yourself. Why are we categorizing people as property? At least that's what I think that's what people were supposed to think, and I think it did provoke a lot of people to think about things and see things in different ways. And so by all accounts, Frederick Douglass was a very powerful speaker. He was provocative and creative and mesmerizing and oftentimes really very, very funny. And he could, through the power of his words, written and spoken, because he wrote an awful lot too, he could get people to see things more clearly if they were willing to listen. And that's a big if, right? Because human nature is that if we're not open to listening, we're not really going to hear. And many people were not. And part of that's because Frederick Douglass lived a life that was grounded in challenging, powerful people and systems. And, if you identify with some of those systems, those people, you may not like it. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in Maryland in 1818 or maybe 1817. We don't know exactly sure what the year was. His father was white. Probably his father was his slave owner. His mother, of course, a black enslaved person. This happened far more often than what whites would admit, that a lot of people were born in this situation of a system that enabled white men to abuse black and exploit black women with impunity. And I don't know, that must have had a profound psychological and emotional impact on him, to think that my father is also this slave owner. He lived as as a child, he lived and saw a lot of cruelties of slavery, of course, in a lot of ways, and many of these are listed or described, rather, in his narrative. By the time he was 8, he witnessed at least 7 brutal beatings or killings of slaves, of black people. Religiously, he had a conversion experience at a revival led by a Methodist preacher when he was about 13 or 14 years old. But he also had, and he switched masters at different times in his life. He also had a master who had a conversion experience. And that master treated him cruelly. And so he gets this understanding also. He has this spiritual experience, but then he also realizes other people can have this spiritual experience, but the experience alone doesn't guarantee that they're going to treat other people with justice and decency and so forth. So that I think informs him quite a bit. With help from one of his female slave owners and also boys in town, and he had a way of engaging and finagling them. He taught himself to read and write. He would get them to like with the boys in town, he'd go in and he'd brag and say, "I can read better than you." And he goes, "Oh, no." And they'd pull out a book and the boys would read, and that's how he'd learn. In the days before you had pick-up basketball games. That's what you do. He, with the help of a free black woman who later became his wife, he escaped to freedom at age 20. He dressed as a sailor and managed to get documents from another black and got tickets, saved up money and got tickets to board a train and then a ferry and a boat, made his way to Philadelphia. Rather terrifying. The Underground Railroad was a rather terrifying experience, trying to run away and realizing you could get caught and the punishment would be really, really bad. But he eventually made his way to Massachusetts, to New Bedford, and worked various jobs there, but also for a while was a preacher in the AMEZ church there. Once again, the role of that black independent church was there. But then he got involved in the abolitionist movement. He was a gifted speaker. And at age 27, he's only 27 years old, he publishes his memoir, which later on in his life he would revise several times, a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. By the time the Civil War broke out, about 15 years later, it had sold 30,000 copies, which is really pretty good for the time. It's still in print today. It's definitely worth reading. It's about his life in slavery. It's about learning to read. It's about reading and picking up ideas about freedom and a number of other things. His escape, his life as a free man. Realize this also. When he published his memoir, he was still a fugitive. He was not legally free. And now he was revealing his identity. And so it took a lot of courage because he could still, at that time, be hunted down and captured and taken back into slavery. And of course, most fugitives want to lay low that way. But Frederick Douglass, felt like he had to speak. He had to speak out. That's who he was. That's who God called him to be, he believed. The spiritual challenge for Frederick Douglass and for many other blacks: how do you control and direct the oppression? How do you control and direct the anger you feel from the oppression, the anger and the loss you feel from these injustices that you have faced? And that was a real challenge. He tried to do it. Sometimes he tried to do it by explaining, that distinction between a corrupted Christianity and Christianity as he believed it should be. Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, woman-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. He's not going to pull punches. He's going to go right at it. And, I think that if we are to understand someone like this who has a great deal of anger, we have to ask, why are you angry? And if you read his memoir, well, then you can understand why he is angry about the slaveholding, women whipping, cradle plundering. I mean, it's all true, right? This is a system that we had in the United States this time. Compared to other black Christians, Douglas drew more from the Old Testament than the New Testament. He did not speak a lot about the cross or salvation. That doesn't come up in his writings very much. But he did believe very strongly in a providential God and of God's judgment on slavery. And he draws very deeply from the side of black Christianity that emphasizes justice and liberation, which, by the way, that's black Christianity. That should be Christianity in general, right? Should be for justice and liberation. So he was, as this quote shows, quite critical of hypocrisy of ministers or a nation that claimed to be Christian and held slaves at the same time. That sort of thing. And he drew from Christian faith for that. There was a woman later on in his life, a German woman who was a writer who came over that he got to be really very, very close to and probably had an affair with. But she was an atheist, and she tried to convince Frederick Douglass that atheism was the truth and tried to draw him away from Christianity. But he never abandoned it. The Old Testament prophets were his model and his inspiration and his source of truth, especially Isaiah and Jeremiah, the story of Exodus. He especially took on the style of Jeremiah. There's a phrase that's sometimes used by historians and theologians called it the Jeremiad, which is speaking in the style of Jeremiah, which is that society has strayed away from its roots. Jeremiah preaching to Judah in right before the Babylonian captivity. You've strayed away from your roots. You've fallen into sin and so forth. That declension, and that's the style that Frederick Douglass would use. That he believed the United States was born with these roots of freedom and liberty and its ideals and the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and we have strayed away, which, by the way, by the 1840s and 50s, there was a certain amount of truth to that because slavery was getting even more deeply embedded. We weren't actually moving away from slavery, at least not in the South. The North had become free, but in the South, it was getting more deeply embedded in things, and, well, of course, that's going to end up in the Civil War. He was criticized for irritating Americans. And he says, I admit that I have irritated them. They deserve to be irritated. As it is in physics, so in morals, there are cases that demand irritation and counter-irritation. The conscience of the American public needs this irritation. And maybe you can see why Jeremiah was an inspiration for him. But he did speak, he's speaking about the nation, speaking about the United States, and he says, the best friend of a nation is he, sorry, that's a typo there. The best friend of a nation is he who most faithfully rebukes her for her sins. And he, her worst enemy, who, under the specious garb of patriotism, seeks to excuse, palliate, or defend them. What is a real patriot? Frederick Douglass says, somebody who points out your sins so that you can do something about it, not somebody who covers over them or ignores them, palliates them, excuses them, or defends them. In the decade before the Civil War of the 1850s, he became even more outspoken, if that was possible, and forceful arguer against slaveholders. He argued the slaveholders were not Christian. You just have missed the gospel if you own slaves. He abandoned pacifism. A lot of white abolitionists also included peace and pacifism as part of what they're about. Frederick Douglass, well, he initially adopted it with as he became an abolitionist, but over time he said no. He gave up the idea of pacifism. One key event was he was speaking in Indiana, and a mob grabbed him after the speech and beat him nearly to death. And after that experience, he felt like, oh no, we got to fight back. Is what led him to that. He encouraged slaves to run away, and abolitionists and anti-slavery people to actively resist slave owners. There was a somewhat famous event of the whole Underground Railroad and fugitive slaves that took place in 1851, where there were some fugitives running away from slavery in southern Pennsylvania and Christiana, Pennsylvania, and they got connected with some people, and the bounty hunters or slave owners came up to find them, and it broke out into a gunfight, and some of the slave owners were killed. There were more than 150 violent encounters with runaway slaves during this time. I mean, it was quite the thing. But a couple of those runaway slaves, after the gun battle, made their way to Rochester, New York, with some help. And Rochester's where Frederick Douglass was living, and Douglass helped them escape into Canada. He knew John Brown. You know John Brown and Harper's Ferry and that sort of thing. He knew John Brown for 15 years before Harper's Ferry, and then when they got up to the time of Harper's Ferry, he actually interacted with John Brown quite a bit and knew of John Brown's plan and considered supporting it, and then heard more about it and thought, no, this is crazy. This isn't going to work. This is not practical. So he didn't support it. But at that time, Frederick Douglass was saying that the fate of the United States depended on the liberation of slaves. This is what it comes down to. Are we going to liberate slaves or not? That will determine the fate of the U.S. When the Civil War broke out, little review here for you maybe, or I don't know. Maybe you didn't have good history teachers, but when the Civil War, just in case, I'll lay this down. When the Civil War broke out, by the way, Southerners, if you actually look at the secession documents, Southern politicians are really pretty clear. This is about slavery. Despite the fact that many Southerners, they say no, it was about states' rights. I mean, if you look at it, they are talking slavery left and right. But in the North, Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party said, we are just trying to hold the nation together. Union, this is all about union. And he tries to, although he was anti-slavery, he said we're not, for political reasons, he says we're not trying to eliminate slavery, because he's still trying to convince the southern states to stay in. Frederick Douglass had a different view of things. He said, the American people and the government may refuse to recognize it for a time, but the inexorable logic of events will force it upon them in the end that the war now being waged in this land is a war for and against slavery. And historians today say he was right, that the underlying causes and forces about this was slavery, and slavery did force itself upon the people and upon Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans, like, you know, if we're going to win this war, we got to free the slaves, undermine the Confederacy, undermine their economy and everything, issue the Emancipation Proclamation and so forth. So Frederick Douglass, he knew what he was talking about. With emancipation, when it did come, Douglass believed it was an act of God, evidence that God was defeating evil, perfecting humanity, kind of a millennial sense of God's work in the world in that particular sort of way. And then when the Civil War ended, he was worried that the U.S. would lose most of what it had gained with emancipation by refusing to allow full freedom and equality to blacks. A very justified concern. And for 6 months, he gave speeches where he preached on Lot's wife. If you know about Lot's wife, who became a pillar of salt when she looked back at Sodom and Gomorrah, oftentimes this is interpreted as she was looking back and longing for what she was leaving behind, saying, I want that thing we have had, but that thing we have had was corrupt and sinful and evil. And so Frederick Douglass says you're going to look back and say you want that, but that thing we had was corrupt and evil. Instead, he says you look at Abraham. Abraham looked afterwards on the plain of Sodom and Gomorrah, saw the destruction and said, we have caused this. And Frederick Douglass said, this is how you look at the Civil War. All this destruction, we have caused this because of our support for slavery. He continued to speak on racial matters through the rest of his life, and race came up in a number of ways. In 1884, he married a white woman. His previous wife had died, and this caused a great deal of controversy and scandal in the press at the time, and Frederick Douglass did not get ruffled by that. He was very, very conscious. Interracial unions, his father was a white man. And Frederick Douglass drew upon Acts 17, which a lot of blacks drew on. God has made one race, as it was interpreted in the words in the King James Version. God has made one race of all the people of the earth. We are all one race. And he said, I adopt the theory that in time the varieties of races will be blended into one. You may say that Frederick Douglass considers himself a member of one race that exists. He's basically saying, look, my mom was black, my father was white. He says, look, a million Americans were mixed race because of the exploitation of black women by white men. So, why are you arguing now against somebody who in, a consensual union of, getting married in a proper sort of way? Later on in the 1890s, lynchings were expanding in the South as a way to establish segregation, as segregation was getting built in. We'll hear more about that later from Andrea Ramsey when she talks about Ida Wells. Frederick Douglass argued that the conflict was not really about rape, which was widely believed, that black men were being lynched because they had raped a white woman. He says, mobs know the victim is innocent. The issue is whites are afraid of black ambition, and that's really what drove segregation, to erect ceilings to prevent black competition. We'll close with Frederick Douglass's view of Christianity, going back to his very famous speech he gave, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, which is a speech he gave in 1854. And towards the end, basically in that speech, he said, you white people go out and celebrate the 4th of July and freedom and liberty. A slave looks at this and says, that just seems very, very hypocritical. It just doesn't resonate with me at all. But towards the end of that speech, he said, real Christianity is first pure, then peaceable, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Americans should cease to do evil, learn to do well, relieve the oppressed, judge for the fatherless, plead for the widow. So that's Frederick Douglass speaking on justice. It occurs to me today is Reformation Sunday, and one thing we do is recognize people who have gone before us, many of them in kilts, and Scottish sort of people, which is what I think good Presbyterians should do. But as Christians, I think we should think about all of the saints and Christians who've gone before us, that we should be thankful for, including those who worked for justice and worked to abolish slavery, which of course is wonderful for blacks, but is also important for whites as well in various ways. So, all right, questions, comments? Yeah, go ahead, Dan. Sure.
So last week I ended with one of my personal thoughts, and I'm sorry for doing it again. But I have to tell you, sitting here today was very inspirational, and it comes with this background. I was not a great student in high school, and in fact, the thing I did not like the most was history. And I kept telling my mother, who happened to be my Sunday school teacher, graduate of Malone, I kept telling my mother, I can't do this school stuff, I don't like history, and she begged me the difference. But she never told me, as much as she taught me about my religion and faith, that history would play into it. And I am now old enough to realize what I've missed. And I just wanted to take this opportunity on behalf of all the class members, I hope, to say thank you for making history come alive. It took me 68 years to know that history was living and how important it is in my spiritual faith background and what I didn't understand. And I'm almost to the point of tears, so I'm going to stop crying or stop talking before I cry. But I want to thank you again for making this come so alive and making us realize the importance of this topic and our reaction with our entire faith community. And again, I thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan. That's kind and gracious words. I think really it comes, you do what you're called to do, and I'm called to be a historian, and you all are called to be other sorts of things, and that's, that's part of living out our calling. Yes.
I just basically wanted to say that I don't think you missed anything. This part was not in history. That was not in the history books. That was not taught.
Right.
Black history
Yeah.
was left out. So when you were in school for history, it was not in the history books.
Yeah,
So
it wasn't, and
you
I
came
think
here.
probably most of us would realize, of our age, will remember. I mean, I can remember. I liked history, and we learned about slavery, but then it didn't go into it. I didn't learn about Frederick Douglass. For most of us, maybe the first time we encountered American history where blacks were real people and active was the series Roots. Right? I mean, it was not in the school. So yeah, there was. Yeah. So, yes.
I have, as I've learned more about Frederick Douglass, because I just finished reading not his autobiography, but the biography. Of
Oh,
Frederick
good for
Douglass.
you.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think everybody in the country should read it. I seriously
Yeah.
do. But my concern is, okay, he was so forceful and he was so right about everything he said, and he hit so many people. Why did we go so far backwards? We seem to be just reliving that over and over and over again, and nobody's listening. Nobody's paying attention, which is why I think everybody should read the book.
Yeah. I don't know what exactly to say about that, except that we don't like to hear things that we don't like to hear. And part of it is human nature, but it's a big, complicated sort of question.
I assume that this Douglas is the one with Lincoln-Douglas debates?
No, different. Lincoln-Douglas debate is Stephen Douglas with one S. So I know, and they're contemporaries, and so you got two Douglases there. And Stephen Douglas was a white man and not a friend to blacks at all, actually. Yeah.
I don't know if this is a correct analysis or not, but we have some German friends who are very close in age to us, within like a year. And when we talked with them one time, they have a son and a daughter, and their son would be about the same age as our sons, because they did an exchange. So they would be like in their, right now, early 40s. And he studied history in Germany growing up, and only then did he find out the history of the Jews and the Holocaust. His parents, who were our age, there was nothing that they were ever taught growing up. And I think probably just like Americans don't like listening about slavery, I think that the Germans, the ones who were the teachers, they didn't want to mention anything that they had just lived through. He said, growing up, the father, who is our age, growing up, he would be playing on piles of rubble, in the city that he lived in, not even knowing why that was there. Teachers never said a word about it. And a generation later, finally, his son was taught in history, and was very much impacted.
Yeah, that's an interesting sort of comparison of how do we deal with injustices in our past in history, because the human nature is let's just leave that all behind. I think Germany now is doing better than a lot of other countries, but for about a decade it was true that and at different levels. I mean, gradually the government would admit to things, but sometimes down on local level in schools they wouldn't. I guess in some places they wouldn't talk about it that much. But it is difficult. Japan officially has a hard time facing some of the things that what is sometimes called the rape of Nanking, or its invasions of China during World War II. It's just, when you have this devotion and loyalty to a people group, like anything else, you don't like to face the bad things that are in the past, and that's something we need to work against. Edith.
So from what you've said and the comments, it seems to me like there's two parts to this, that each generation has to rework at this point in time what the issues are. That even when we're taught about this in history, I mean, when I was being taught, it was the civil rights took care of this, Martin Luther King solved it.
Yeah.
And that's not true. And so even teaching it historically doesn't help in the present unless we translate it to what are we doing. And as Christians, I think Frederick Douglass is absolutely right. We are all the more responsible, all the more charged to be a part of that transforming God's kingdom on earth. And to the extent that we ignore that, we're judged. We are not faithful. And that distresses me.
Yeah, I think that's a great points and great insight. It's true that every generation has to. Yeah, history is always, we're always interpreting and drawing conclusions and thinking about what this means. And that's a continuous conversation that we need to have. And sometimes we don't have the right conversations, or we need a conversation to push us further. Yeah. Well, thank you all really very, very much for your comments. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we pray that we would be open to hearing from others and open to hearing things that maybe are uncomfortable or we don't want to hear. Open so that we can become more of the people that you want us to be. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.